We're going to talk a little bit about why the stress response sticks around, right? Because you would say, well, so like, say you've got a kid who's in an environment where maybe they don't feel unsafe at home, or there's something going on at school, or they're being bullied, or whatever it is. When they're not in the presence of that stressor, why are they still so activated? And there's a few reasons for that. The first is that when you've been traumatized, things that are similar to the dangerous situation set off an adrenaline response, where that's where we were talking about before about how the body reacts in a very similar way. So when you're cued, if you have adrenaline response, it becomes very difficult. Obviously, you've got those hormones pulsing through your veins now. It becomes very difficult to regulate and to modulate yourself. That also, when we talk about PTSD related nightmares, is where those nightmares come from. You're dreaming, your mind wanders on to a memory of what happened. And because you're at a point where your body has that adrenaline response, you mix adrenaline with a nightmare. And that's why you thrash. That's why you sweat. That's why you might wake up screaming or scared. It's because the adrenaline is working its way into a nightmare and it takes it to a whole different level. And that makes it feel like it's very real and present, as if it's happening now. So that then leads a young person, or any person really of any age, to really try to avoid these types of situations. And avoidance is a primary protective strategy when it comes to trauma. It's very, those situations where you feel awful about yourself, or you feel like you're in danger, you don't want to feel that way pretty much no matter what. And so again, when you start looking at behaviors that a young person might be exhibiting and thinking, wow, like it seems like they're doing things that are having a lot of blowback and causing them a lot of pain. Why are they doing that? Well, there's an answer to that question. And it will actually make a lot of sense when you understand what's going on under the surface, why they're, I would say, like doing antisocial activities, or like being part of a gang. Well, gangs can be great if you want to say feel like you have a family. If you don't feel like you have a family at home, or want to feel safe in an environment and you don't feel safe at home, it can seem like a really good solution. So avoiding situations and people, places that make you feel so negative feels very, very important. Sometimes regardless, again, of that long-term downstream cost. And that's again because the part of our brain that thinks that way isn't working quite as well when we're under stress or in a toxic stress situation. Avoiding internal reminders of what happened also feels very important, because memories or reminders can then trigger that adrenaline. So when, again, we talk about substances, you'll very oftentimes see people who have been through a traumatic situation misuse substances, because that way they don't have to think about what they don't want to think about. Or they may just, another very common internal avoidance strategy is staying very busy. Because if you're just busy and working all the time, you don't have time to think about what you don't want to think about. Or being very absorbed in screens, your phone, those sorts of things. Again, the reminders are a big part of what keeps this around. Getting back to this question of why the stress response then persists when you're acting out, even when, say, you're not at home, as both of those examples were about. So one of the core elements of how we understand trauma, at least from a cognitive lens, which is how I'm going to present it today, is that they result in learning specialized coping behaviors to try to control the situation and create a sense of safety. So I already talked about, for example, that being hyper aware of the emotions of others. It could also be someone needing to be please or to be liked, being highly conflict avoidant. If you've learned, if I cause a conflict, this is just going to be worse for me. Someone dissociating or avoiding stressful situations. Safety behaviors are huge. And I think we talk about it a bit later in the presentation, but just in case we don't, when I say safety behavior, a really important concept that I like to define for most of the folks I work with around this, a safety behavior, or it can also be a safety object, but it's something that you have or do that makes you feel like you're safe, even though that doesn't actually do anything, because you were safe the whole time. So like if you're avoiding, like if a stressful situation, say, is procrastination, for example, is a safety behavior. You think about your test, you feel anxious. but you don't think about your test or your homework assignment, you don't feel anxious. So you will avoid doing anything about it. You will procrastinate for as long as you can until the distress you feel avoiding it is greater than the distress you think you'll feel if you engage with it. And that's when you finally do it. So it's all about avoiding the stress. That's a perfect situation, though, in terms of thinking. Like, there's nothing actually stressful about the assignment itself. It's just the belief about the assignment. And even then, you do it and it gets better, right? Then it's done and you don't have to think about it anymore. You study for the test, you get a good grade, you get a better outcome than you might from avoiding thinking about it. But nonetheless, when you're talking about a trauma, because it cuts all the way down to our survival mechanisms a lot of the time, these feelings of ACEs, of toxic stress, it feels incredibly difficult to approach situations that feel stressful. And so you might see that behavioral avoidance or basically like cognitive avoidance, where someone basically just disappears and they wall off and they're there in body, but not really, in mind or in spirit. Not trusting other people, particularly authority figures, might come out. Hoarding resources if you feel like I need to get what I can because I'm not sure when any more is going to come. Hurting or pushing away others before they can hurt them first. So like if I don't get close to you or I keep you at arm's length, then you can't emotionally hurt me just like everybody else, right? It makes a bunch of sense if you look at it through through that lens. But if you don't, it can seem like why is this child being so oppositional? Why are they being so standoffish? Perfectionism, as I mentioned before, self-harm also, right? So when we talk about self-harm, the most common reasons I hear for why people cut themselves or burn themselves or self-harm in some way is either to not feel pain that they don't want to feel. Like, I'm going to feel physical pain, and that makes me not feel or think about the emotional pain, and that is actually preferable to me. Or sometimes it's to feel something, right? If that mechanism of avoiding emotional pain is to just to wall off and numb out, then someone's just looking for a way to feel something again, even if that feeling is negative. It creates all these very, for lack of a better word, maladaptive coping strategies where you're just trying to be normal, just trying to be normal. But the act of doing so, particularly if you do it in an unhealthy way, like again, in the short term, maybe it feels like it helps, but in the long term, not so much. Eating disorders are another very common response to toxic stress or traumatic stress, in that it's a method of control, right? If you don't feel like you can control anything in your life, but what you can control is whether or not you eat, either by getting a lot of pleasure, by binge eating, or by losing weight. And feeling like that's something that you can hang your hat on, that you can be good at, that you can feel good about. And what happens then is when you do some of these either safety behaviors or these workarounds that aren't healthy, but when you get a negative outcome because of the safety behavior, it locks the belief in place because you never give yourself an opportunity to learn. You just think, oh, I avoid being in this situation, or I keep everybody at arm's length. And look, no one is, I'm not getting hurt emotionally by it. No one's letting me down anymore. So this works. The problem is, of course, right, there are some people who maybe you shouldn't let close because they'll hurt you. But then there's a lot of people who you could actually have very meaningful relationships with, who you are putting up walls between yourself and because you're afraid of something that could happen. And so you don't get the ability to get to a more balanced belief. And that's, when we think about how do we work with kids and adults around issues related to trauma, a lot of it comes down to these questions of what are the beliefs that are unbalanced. And what we're going to how we're going to talk about them today is we're going to call them stuck points. A stuck point is a belief that causes you problems, regardless of if it's right or wrong, although usually at the very least, it's an unbalanced belief, one that's a little extreme in one direction or another. And we'll talk more about that in just a second. But when you avoid testing that belief because you avoid it in some way, or you only do one particular behavior that means you don't test a belief, you can always just assume it's true all the time, even if it's not true most of the time, or was only true in a certain traumatic set of circumstances, but is not necessarily so true in other ones. And so that's a big part of it though. So one part of why the stress response persists is that adrenaline burst that you get. Another one is learning and the beliefs that you get from going through one of these events, and then the avoidance of that opportunity to learn something new on top of that.